Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this keynote panel, Destructive and Generative Ruptures in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have three speakers, and their bios promise really thought-provoking interventions. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, and at the end, we will have approximately 30 minutes, I expect, for discussion. And you can place your questions in the Q&A as they speak if questions, ideas come to you then. So let me tell you who they are. And I will introduce them in the order in which they are going to present. Professor Clara Irazábal is the director of the Urban Studies and Planning Program in the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation here at the University of Maryland. Virtually here, that is. She previously was the director of the Latinx and Latin American Studies program and professor of planning at the University of Missouri. A product of the Americas, she has studied at UC Berkeley and the Central University of Venezuela. So perhaps it's not surprising that in her research, she's interested in placemaking, culture, politics, and their impact on community development and socio-spatial justice in Latin America, in Latin American cities and US Latinx immigrant and minority communities. Professor Irazábal has published academic work in, and wait for it, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. Among her published work is a book on urban governance and city making in the Americas, and an edited volume, Transbordering Latin Americas, Liminal Places, Cultures, and Powers. And I'm really interested in that title. Notice it's not Transbordering Latin America, it's Transbordering Latin Americas. Professor Irazábal is an editorial board member of internationally accredited architectural and planning journals and book presses, including associate editor of the Journal of the American Planning Association. She has taught award-winning planning and multidisciplinary studios internationally in Brazil, Colombia, Chile, and Trinidad and Tobago, and domestically in Latinx, Black and immigrant and refugee communities. So that's will be our first speaker. Our second speaker, I'll introduce all three and then they will simply begin. Our second speaker, Professor Yanilda Maria González, is an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research focuses on policing, state violence, and citizenship in democracy, examining how race, class, and other forms of inequality shape these processes. Her forthcoming book sounds right in line with current discussions. It's entitled Authoritarian Police in Democracy, Contested Security in Latin America. It studies the persistence of police forces as authoritarian enclaves in otherwise democratic states, demonstrating how ordinary democratic politics in unequal societies can both reproduce authoritarian policing and bring about rare moments of expansive reforms. Professor González received her PhD in politics and social policy from Princeton University. Professor Daniel Coleman is a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. They is a transdisciplinary, transfeminist artist scholar, currently working at the intersections of performance studies, Black diaspora studies, decolonial thought, trans studies, Afro and indigenous cosmologies, Black feminisms, critical ecologies, and performance as research. The current book project, Trans Ecologies at the End of the Human, is a poetic, epistemological, and performance research process that moves between Greensboro, North Carolina, and San Cristobal de las Casas, Chiapas. Professor Coleman is trained as an oral historian and critical performance ethnographer. And the bio says that they are invested in listening to the voices of the Black diaspora in the Americas. So we have three really wonderful, thought-provoking bios for three excellent scholars. So we look forward to hear what they have to say. And we will begin with you, Professor Irazábal.
Thank you very much for having me, for inviting me to this conference and this panel. I want to particularly thank the organizing graduate students of this conference because they have made a phenomenal work. I have attended several of the panels have been amazed at the quality of the presentation and the diversity of them. And I would also want to welcome and thank my fellow panelists here because with their presence, they are bringing further legitimacy to the national and even international reach that I think this conference now have. Thank you for sharing this space with us. And I'm entitled my presentation with the title of the conference because I find it enormously evoking, disruptions. And it is exactly what I have tried to do with my work. And I hope that you can appreciate that through this presentation. So I'm going to start by sharing with the audience the questions that we, the panelists, received, because I think that we cannot exhaust them in this panel, and they serve the audience very well. We need to continue exploring them. So in what way do you see your own research methodologies as disruptive? For whom do you write? How does the notion of community impact or shape your research? What hegemonic structures appear dangerously sound? What promised disruptions remain unfulfilled? And what new visions and possibilities of disruption do you see emerging in the 21st century in Latin America and the Caribbean? I'm going to share some thoughts related to these questions and offer a couple of examples from my own work to illustrate them. So starting with the first one on research methodologies as disruptive. Before we talk about methodologies itself, and I need to click on this, we need to examine what is it that we do research about. What are our research questions to start with? And I'm gonna invoke two different people here, but share some commonality addressing this question. And it's Karl Marx, and he said that the task is not just to understand the world, but to change it. And I'm going to say that there are many researchers that are satisfied with understanding the world and explaining it. And I think that there's a lot of contribution in doing that. But in fields like many of the ones that are represented at this conference, and certainly the one that I'm coming from in urban planning, we're interested in transforming the world. And we're unapologetic about that. So that's the type of questions, that's the type of research that we invest in. Be the change you want to see in the world, because you embody your research. You have to be passionate about what you research, and you embody your research with your full life and senses, but also the research embodies you back. The research embodies your values, and it is good that it is congruence in there. So in my work, I always depart from a normative premise. Planning should be emancipatory. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it should always lead to conditions, to outcomes that liberate communities from oppressive social and spatial conditions, that is lack of affordable housing or public health or recreational opportunities or educational opportunities and the sort. And it should seek to expose the many ways and guises under which planning fails to deliver in this emancipatory promise. But when it does that, it also points to ways in which planning can become better, how this planning paradox of not delivering on emancipation can be overcome and realized. And I have 3 areas in which I do work. The first one is migration and ethnic urbanism, understanding that migration is a large and growing phenomenon around the world, and it requires a lot of efforts for immigrant and refugee integration in the hosting societies. And urbanism plays a large and ever larger role in that integration. Urban resilience and rehabilitation, understanding that we're facing a lot of traumatic events that are disrupting conditions in cities, not only the ones that are coming about by climate change, but the chronic ones come about by poverty and inequality, and also political disruptions of different kinds, many of which we see in Latin America. And then third, regional and transnational, or even better, transbordering planning, understanding that we need to plan at different scales, from the local, the metropolitan, the state, the regional, the country, and even the global levels. A note on research. Of course, you know that no method is perfect or complete. Therefore, we need to always be very context dependent in the manner in which we select which methods to operate. No method is intrinsically bad or biased. People may be biased. So we need to be mindful of what type of bias we invest in our work, and the bias that other research also brings to us. Complex social questions demand complex approaches to research, and therefore combining research methods, triangulating them always help. Quantitative methods can produce approximations to the what question, what is happening with this society, but quantitative methods approximate responses to the why questions. Why is this society becoming less just, less sustainable, or whatever the case is, so that we can address the root causes of the matter. In my own qualitative work, and the one that I share and do with my students, particularly through studio courses, we use a number of methods. You have a list in here. Maybe we can come back in the Q&A session to that, but it goes all the way. It runs the gamut from historic and institutional analysis and literature review to observation, participant observation, case studies, comparative case studies, the design of recommendations, which is a method in and of itself, how you do that, and then dissemination of the results or the findings and such recommendations. Now, a note on audience and community. I think that in all research, we need to be mindful of and very deliberate about who we're speaking with and who we're speaking to. And ideally, we're speaking with people and we're speaking to people. We're speaking with the people that we are doing research about their communities and with their communities, hopefully through participatory action research and co-design and the socialization of different facets of research, ultimately to continue their evolution on their own empowerment. And then we are always delivering work, particularly through publications and presentations that speak to these same people that we did research about and with, but also decision makers and policy makers and professionals of different kinds, and to the larger public. So ideally, we're not only speaking to scientists, to others like us in our disciplines, but also to the larger public. Here in Brazil, for example, I've done research with the social housing movements, the ones that do a lot of research to occupy spaces that are vacant or underutilized in cities and suburbs, to claim attention to the fact that it is enshrined in the Brazilian constitution that housing is a human right, so that the authorities need to participate in delivering it. And we produced this report that was a part of a studio work done with students. And then I also did scholarly work that affirm that disruption that these social movements do, countering land grabbing things for the sake of the poor, for the sake of the houseless in Brazil. Moving forth, hegemonic structures and disruptions unfulfilled. A lot to say about this. Let us just say that we're facing a quadripartite crisis. We're having the pandemic, which is a public health crisis that have enlarged our economic crisis and have produced greater visibility to the racial injustices and social injustices that we face. And all of that is also emerged in the climate crisis. Maybe the virus in and of itself was created by the climate transformation that we're suffering. So what type of world we have out of that? Seems like we're facing a monster of many heads. It's difficult to grapple with it and let alone combat it. But that we must do. And I think that we need to, for doing that, we need to challenge the current developmental paradigm. And let's name it, it's capitalism. And more explicitly, it's neoliberalism. And for the people interested in sustainable design and sustainable planning, such as ourselves in the urban planning field, we have come to believe that if we articulate a good balance between these three E's portrayed here, economy, equity, and environment, we are going to get at sustainability. We can tame capitalism. But the fact of the matter is that under capitalism, we're always favoring economic growth. Too much so that we do it at the expense of equity and the environment. And this is unsustainable. And what we need is to flip this equation and put on top of it our intent of creating a world that is more equitable and more sustainable. And then the economy then turns from an ends in and of itself to a means and instruments by which we get to that world what we envision. And one idea coming from Latin America and work that I have done and currently I'm doing on the Venezuelan Grand Housing Mission, that is the social housing plan that the country has, that is creating many, many units of social housing for free for the people in very precious areas of the cities, including the capital, Caracas, that is bringing the poor to central areas of the city, the contrary migration that gentrification usually produces, displacing the poor from central urban areas. So this is reverse gentrification in Caracas, and it's only coming about by decommodifying land and decommodifying housing. It's important for us to examine those processes. And then fourth and lastly, visions and possibilities of disruption in Latin America and the Caribbean. We can do a semester on this and certainly a lot more. I would only say that we need to reclaim our imagination. The first step to get to a different world would be to imagine it, right? So how does a sustainable and just Latin American and Caribbean region look like? And how do we get there in order to direct our efforts in that direction? We first need to imagine it, and imagine people have done, and imagine people continue to do in Latin America in very inspirational ways in which brings balance between sustainability and justice, which I think are benchmarks that we always need to have in front of us. So what are some of the things that need to be done immediately and continue to be done? Rebalancing those 3 E's of economy, environment, and equity, living within our ecosystems capacity, that of our own countries, but also certainly our own planet that is finite. Focus a lot more on climate change, adaptation, mitigation, resilience, and the disasters that it is bringing that would demand a lot of preparedness, response, and reconstruction in manners that bring about greater justice, in manners that are instruments for greater justice, and justice of multiple kinds: environmental justice, climate justice, racial justice, intergenerational and interspecies justice. Is not only about humanity, it is about the entire living world and even the inanimate world. Such as people did in Chile after the 2010 earthquake, the largest that we have recorded in human history. And people in communities got together. We did examine what happened in the intermediate city of Talca in the middle of Chile, and how is it that they put forth processes and outcomes, that is, projects and plans that delivered a reconstruction that would have brought about a lot more justice and sustainability if the city government and the federal government would have allowed them to stand. So people were contesting TINA, as this article that we wrote and won an award as the most important international planning article in the journal of our field. Contesting TINA, I mean, contesting there is no alternative. TINA, there is no alternative but capitalism or but neoliberalism. I mean, it turned out that yes, there are alternatives, and communities are pointing to them. And indigenous communities in Latin America, the Andean communities of Bolivia and Ecuador in particular, but certainly others in the region, have come about with this notion, have lived with this notion of buen vivir, living in coordination and in balance with the entire ecosystem and within its biocapacity. We can certainly learn from that. We don't need necessarily to reinvent the wheel, but learn from the South, learn from history, and continue our disruptions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Irazábal. You've given us a lot to think about there. Tina. So we're going against Tina, and we think of the power of the imagination to help create a balance between sustainability and justice. It's interesting to me that you started off by making us think about Karl Marx, and the task is not just to understand the world, but to change it. So I know we have lots of questions coming for you, but before that, let's have our second speaker, Professor Yanilda González. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Collins. I want to also thank the Latin American Study Center for the invitation to speak to all of you today. And it's really wonderful to be a part of this conversation and to be invited to think about disruption. I think I'm thankful that my co-panelist, Professor Irazábal, posed the questions, the prompts that we were asked to think about for this conversation today, because I think the idea of sort of generative disruptions, I think, is one that I find very productive and very helpful for thinking about my work going forward, but really even just this moment that we're in. And just one of the questions that Professor Irazábal highlighted is about what hegemonic structures appear dangerously sound and able to withstand the disruptive efforts for progress and change. And I wanted to sort of talk about today one of the, the thing that I've been dedicating my research to over, more than a decade now, which is policing as a structure that is that the more I study it, the more I realize how impervious it seems to be to change, to reform, and all of that, and why my research took a particular change of direction in light of that understanding that policing is a deeply resistant structure and an institution resistant to change. And so I wanted to sort of, as a junior scholar, it's always great to sort of hear from, colleagues like Professor Irazábal and sort of their trajectory in research. And so I wanted to sort of share, since this is a graduate student conference, I wanted to share a little bit about my research trajectory around this notion of disruption, and to see, I would have found a conversation like that very helpful when I was a graduate student. And so in case it is helpful to anyone in the audience, I wanted to sort of share a bit about that. And so as Professor Collins noted, my research has focused on a lot of policing, police reform, state violence in the context of Latin America. And I approach these issues from the perspective of political science, which is what I'm trained in. And so I think that I'm sort of organizing my remarks today around a series of takeaways. And sort of the first takeaway that I wanted to sort of think about, that I'll speak about for a few minutes, but also just in case folks want to bring these back up in the Q&A, is sort of thinking about the constraints of our discipline, and how we might, and sort of what are some ways of generatively disrupting some of those constraints. And so sort of as a political scientist, my graduate career was spent sort of constantly having to defend studying policing as an enterprise that was important in political science. Because one of the things that I would hear quite often as a graduate student was, is this criminology? Is this sociology? Sort of what is political about this? I mean, obviously now in 2021, I don't think there's anybody who would fail to see what is important and what is political about policing. But it was something that, thinking back 13 years ago when I started my PhD, it was something that I had to constantly defend. And I finished my PhD just around the time that Ferguson happened, the killing of Michael Brown, and all of the mobilizations and uprisings that happened in Ferguson as a result. And so throughout the time of my graduate career, it was really something that was seen as unconventional to study policing, right? Where is a discipline that is largely focused on political parties, elections, legislatures, the presidency, the courts, things like that. Studying policing was not seen as something that was consequential for politics. And so that would be sort of my first sort of disruptive moment, I guess, in my career is sort of focusing on a subject matter that was seen as, at the time, as very unconventional. And so just to for graduate students who are thinking about, maybe the disciplines, that a particular discipline may be interesting to them, but that there may be constraints to that discipline, to think about how do we work beyond our disciplines and the constraints that those pose. I think that, speaking to an anthropologist or sociologist or other folks in other disciplines, they would face different constraints. But as a political scientist, that was one that I encountered really early on, and that I think is really was one that I really had to put a lot more, resistance than I would have anticipated before I began my program. And yet you see that it pays off. Sort of the research. I believe that the research that I did over the course of the past 13 years has really helped me understand and get a different perspective on the moment that we're living in, where policing is being questioned. In throughout the world, really. Of course, we're here in the US, we're very familiar with the massive protests that took place over the last year that continue really to this day. But in Colombia, in Brazil, in Chile, in the Dominican Republic, in Nigeria, in France, in Belgium, in so many countries around the world, policing is being put on the spot. Policing is being questioned as sort of what is the role of policing in society, what ought to be the role of policing in society, and how do we hold police accountable? Any number of ways, rethinking the role of police in society. And in some instances, right, some people are saying we don't want police at all, right? The sort of defund and abolitionist movement. So along a range of questions that people are raising, it's this central political question about policing, right? So the insistence on, thinking beyond your discipline, or being disruptive within your discipline and studying unconventional topics, or studying perhaps conventional topics in unconventional ways, I think was an important takeaway with thinking about my own research within my field, and the constraints that each of our disciplines may pose for each of us. A second takeaway that I wanted to think about along this lines of generative ruptures and disruption, I wanted to, which I think is also very disciplinarily, bounded, but is this notion of objectivity. Right, sort of a social scientist, objectivity is always, and in some ways it's always seen as like a central, central to doing our research. But of course, there's always, and so we always want to minimize bias. We think we know what bias is, we think we know what objectivity is, and we want to sort of always elevate objectivity and minimize bias in our research. But one of the things that I was sort of compelled to think about in the course of my field work was to rethink how I do my research and what does objectivity mean in different contexts, and how do I navigate claims of objectivity when studying highly sensitive subjects with populations that have experienced very serious forms of state-induced trauma, that as I'm working on now. So I was in the field. I was doing field work in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and I was at a trial over a police killing. Various police officers were on trial for a massacre that had occurred in the town of Lasc, right outside of Sao Paulo. And I had always, fashioned myself. Sort of my first book, my dissertation was very much predicated on the notion of like, I'm speaking to everybody, I'm spending time with everybody. I spent time with, hundreds of police officers, community members, human rights activists, politicians, everybody and their mama, to try to understand, policing in all of the different perspectives possible in Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia, which were the places that I was studying. But so when I was at this trial, I was outside, and I had come accompanying human rights activists, family members of people who were incarcerated or who had lost people to police violence. And while I was there was outside the courthouse, there was, two camps of protesters, and one was the protesters of of course, the family members of the victims of the killings who were protesting, but on the other side, there were family members of the police officers who were adopting many of the same strategies that usually victims movements adopt. They had T-shirts with the photos of the police officers. They were claiming, they were making claims about justice and things like that. And so, of course, I found all of this to be fascinating. And sort of my objective self, my objective, scholar, political scientist, really wanted to go over and speak to them, to speak to the family members of the police officers, and hear where they're coming from and what's going on here. But at the time, I didn't do so. Even though it would have been sort of the objective thing to do. Oh my goodness, I'm almost at my time. This is how I get to telling when I get to telling stories from the field. But as I went about the course of the afternoon, I realized that I had taken on a different role in this new research project that was about the mobilization of victims of police violence than had been my previous role as a researcher when I was studying police reform and sort of institutional and social responses to police violence. Long story short, I ended up just really staying on the side, both sort of physically, but also, more methodologically and conceptually on the side of the family members of victims. Because sort of sharing that space with them that day, I realized, I came to perceive and understand that going over to the side of the family members of police would have been perceived, it would have been perceived as a kind of, sort of a whose side are you on, sort of thing. And it would have, I think been a little offensive to the family members that I was accompanying that day. And so it was sort of that internal conversation with myself as a researcher and observing the dynamics on the ground that day that made me realize the importance of sort of that we do ultimately end up taking a side in our research, and sort of claims to objectivity are kind of are overblown. And I'm happy to sort of unpack that further in Q&A if that's of interest. But that one of the things that I learned is that when you are working on and expecting, to share space and to share and to have people share, their pain, to share, very difficult subjects in their lives with you as a researcher, you sort of do owe them a kind of you sort of have to do away, you sort of owe them a sense of support. I'm not going to phrase this I think in the way that I would like, but essentially you sort of have to do away with claims of objectivity, and do have to end up taking a side on the side of your interlocutors. So that doesn't necessarily mean a bias from the perspective of I think I know what the outcome of my research is going to be, but simply to say to sort of sit alongside them and say I believe that what happened to you is unjust. And so this is where a lot of my approach to this new research was shaped by and came from. That an important disruption that had to occur was to think about the notion of the objectivity as a kind of unhelpful for understanding these deeply complex traumatic processes that communities are experiencing around the world. And so just to quickly give an overview of sort of how my research has changed as a response to that experience, I think a lot more now about how to again do away with notions of objectivity or to claims of objectivity that are almost never really there. But also to think about how do we share space, and how do we share our institutional resources and voices with people who typically lack access to them. So how do we create spaces for voice for people that participate in our research, such that we are no longer speaking on behalf of anyone? As researchers, we think that we can tell other people's stories. How do we instead minimize the extent to which we are speaking on behalf of others, and instead create spaces for them to speak with us, alongside us in these spaces? And so I wanted to just briefly talk about two initiatives that I've been a part of that have been important for sort of putting into practice this notion of how do we make our research in the service of our research participants, rather than believing that they're in the service of our research. So one of the initiatives was a transnational collaborative with colleagues in Colombia that sought to bring together family members of victims of police violence from Colombia, Brazil, and the United States. And we met various times, once in Chicago, once in Colombia, once in Boston, and we would have met a fourth time in Brazil, but for the pandemic. But the idea was to sort of break, disrupt the walls, the boundaries that universities establish among themselves, and bring researchers together with community members, and situating those community members front and center on the stage in these universities, so that the person who speaks on these issues is not this researcher or some other professional speaking on behalf of affected communities, but rather the members of those affected communities themselves. So that was sort of one initiative. And just, I want to just take a minute, I know that I'm at time, but I want to just take a minute to talk about another initiative, which is sort of Professor Irazábal mentioned, sort of the importance of participatory action research. And so this is another area where that I'm also trying to work, which is not something that's very common either for my discipline or from folks who are in public policy schools. And so that is bringing together alongside collaborators with the Federal University of Sao Paulo. We're working together with a social movement of mothers of victims of police killings And we're all working together as researchers. So the mothers themselves, the mothers of victims are our co-PIs on the project, and we're all going to work together to research these sort of violent practices of the state and their effects on communities. And so these are just sort of some, very briefly wanted to share a bit about, again, my trajectory as a researcher, and some of the disruptive paths that I've had to try to think about, and that I think might might be helpful for other graduate students to hear, sort of in case that's useful throughout your the early years of your career as well. So thank you once again for the invitation to speak with you today. I really look forward to a broader conversation in a few minutes.
Thank you, Professor González. It's really interesting that the way that the two of you, well, you cast it in terms of the more experienced scholar and the younger scholar, but the way that the two of you, both interested in social justice issues, think so deeply about positionality. How do we approach our research? And in fact, I think Professor Irazábal suggested this kind of question: where am I speaking from and who am I speaking to? And it raises all kinds of questions about how you manage the balance. But thank you very much for that. And thank you also for looking again at two of the questions that you were responding to. The first one that Professor Irazábal also mentioned: how do you see your own research methods as disruptive? And the other question that you came to: what hegemonic structures appear dangerously sound and able to withstand the project for change? And I'm mentioning these so that as people, think about their questions, they also think about what you were responding to. Thank you very much. And now our final speaker, Professor Daniel Coleman.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for this lovely invitation. It's wonderful to be in conversation with everyone. And special thanks to Daniel Laplace and Victor Hernandez for organizing. So I'm going to answer in a disruptive way because my work likes to be disruptive. And prepared a little talk here that addresses each of the questions in more poetic form here. So my brief talk today will focus on the methodological, epistemological, and theoretical matrix through which I locate the performance aspect of my performance as research book project, Trans Ecologies at the End of the Human, and how I have come to Black trans feminist praxis and performance making as part of the disruptive quality of the work I have done in San Cristóbal de las Casas, Chiapas, Mexico. Disruption is a particularly fruitful conversation in the context of Chiapas, given its history and the various types of organizing practices that are ongoing there. I position myself as a mixed Black trans feminist, transmasculine, non-binary, queer artist scholar from the US, invested in Afro and Native Indigenous cosmological relationships to ecology, Black-Brown coalitional work across borders, and Black trans feminist ways of knowing. So in what follows, very briefly, I'll unveil elements of my process, inviting an entrance into the disruptive quality of the work on methodological, theoretical, and practical fronts. I'll explain the impetus behind the project, the Black Trans Feminist Foundation, and how I move with performance. I'll also take a moment to point to where my performance work can be seen, because I won't get a chance to share that today, in San Cristóbal de las Casas, in particular in the summer of 2019. And if there's time, how I'm writing about this moving forward. So the project brings together the sites of Greensboro, North Carolina, and San Cristóbal de las Casas, Chiapas, by virtue of a conversation I forged by moving between North Carolina and Chiapas over a period that now spans 8 years. I'm interested in the conversations between Black civil rights and Native Indigenous sovereignty, respectively, and also seeing these locations within the larger context of ongoing struggles that are not limited to what they are known for. I'm doing this in order to envision new embodiment possibilities and a trans analytic perspective for transgender people of Afro descent, Native Indigenous descent, and mixed descent. So this is who the work is for. The book begins with an understanding that the project of the human as one set into motion by conquest and hegemonic forms of evangelism and extraction world over is at its end. Those contemplated within this human project since the inception of colonial extraction have been making this world less and less viable for all human beings and many other animals. Late capitalism, the white Anthropocene, and necro-empowerment required to maintain its greed is the undoing of this human project. And yet, those maintaining it still language something else to themselves. Our ecosystems are collapsing under the weight of this human-made destruction, and the unequal distribution of wealth and resources is atrociously unconscionable. But somehow, trans people in our bodies become one of the pressure points of attack by those languaging something else to themselves about the state of our ecological downfall. In a world where, quote, the body of every human on the planet now contains strontium-90, a man-made byproduct of nuclear detonations, end quote, I claim that transness has become an alibi for those in power and those aligned with these global powers, and a distraction from the actual issues. We are all modified in ways that we had no agency over, so transness is a convenient and available scapegoat. I see this project as one that supports Afro-descendant, Native Indigenous, and mixed descent peoples of trans experience, who are not trying to be subsumed into cis heteropatriarchal narratives of embodiment or of life. This means that I refuse the conversations about colonized versus decolonized transness in terms of level of medical intervention. That is to say, this project does not care what trans people have or have not done or desire or do not desire to do with our bodies. My poetic goal is to get us out of the correcting towards the quote unquote natural narrative, even if we might have to strategically use this to get access to what we want for our bodies, and to get us beyond the idea that a medically intervened trans body vis-a-vis hormones and or surgeries is a symptom of the medical industrial complex that only westernized infiltration can be responsible for. I refuse that narrative. I want to sustain a simultaneity of what gets seen as irreconcilably impossible and hold us there. So I clarify my position as a Black trans feminist and claim that my work here to be Black trans feminism because I wish to make clear my position as a Black feminist and a trans feminist. Trans feminist thought in different global locations, and my familiarity of it coming from Mexico and Spain in particular, took as its inspiration a return to Black feminist tenets like intersectionality in order to craft its beliefs, even though none of the trans feminists that introduced me to the concept were Black people. I am not interested in claiming trans feminism alone because I see a too convenient absorption of Blackness as genealogy and inspiration, where the major players of its inception were not Black people. Instead of journeying with a feminism inspired by what Black feminists have been saying since the 1970s, I see my work here to be a gathering. Here I am in conversation with the legacy of Black feminism that believes that when all Black women are free, it will necessitate the freedom of all people. I am also in conversation with the legacy of Black feminists and critical theorists who have languaged the grammars of the instability of gender for Black people because of movements like the Black transatlantic slave trade. And then finally, I look to Black feminisms to imagine futures. So what's important here in the context of Mexico and trans feminism is that approximately 1 woman or girl is killed every 4 hours in Mexico. And it's the second most dangerous place in the Americas to be a trans woman after Brazil. So trans feminism becomes a site of resistance to TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists that are rampant, who like to weaponize feminicide as the reason that trans people are distracting from feminist imperatives. Instead, I see this as a really important organizational and coalitional tactic that will help strive for more livable futures. And then my work here is also feminist in its focus on bringing back the intuitive and embodied that have historically been deemed as feminine, or quote unquote belonging to women or irrationality. And I redeem the intuitive and the embodied as feminist praxis and places of knowing, as rigorous as necessary. And this is what brings me to performance. In this work, I made performance as a methodology. So not with the intention of analyzing my performance work in the art critic fashion, but rather for the purposes of sensing, seeing, and feeling the archive that was open to me through the performance choices I intuitively made in the time that I've lived in Chiapas and in North Carolina. Its reliance upon that which is slippery, imperfect, memory-based, and situated in organizing and artistic practices over time. It also means that I've come to honor the spiritual conduits that guide my life and trust that knowing. Intuitive and spiritual knowing is what has kept so many of our people alive. Various feminists of color have also called intuitive ways of knowing and caring for ourselves different things. Gloria Anzaldúa called it la facultad, Audre Lorde called it the erotic, and we could name many other names that feminists of color have used. In this project, I made site-particular performances. I find site-particular performance to be a crucial disruptive engagement with a place like San Cristóbal de las Casas. Site-particular is a term coined by Ilia Noé, moving away from the battlefield that is site-specific performance. Site-specific has been a contested terrain because of the types of relationships artists are quote unquote supposed to or expected to have with the environment they are moving and working in. Site-specific performances and installations are known for being about responding to more codified ideas or realities about a specific place, thereby making work that can respond to hegemonic impulses or be more radical in approach. Site-specific is, quote, used to describe work that is determined by and physically bound to its environmental context, end quote, where, quote, site is defined as the actual material location, end quote. Site particularity instead is open to changing geographies, where there is no opportunity to essentialize a site because sites are not imagined as simply pre-existing, quote, formally, conceptually, or ideologically, end quote, within given geographic constraints. It is here that the language of ecologies becomes very helpful. I see ecology as a framework more suited to site particularity because of the dynamism that is being engaged with in back and forth flow. What is most important to my work and why I took a site-particular approach is it allows site to be constructed in dynamic relationship between the artist, the geography, and audience. I borrow Noé's language here to articulate the relevance of this approach to my work. Quote, it is an ongoing series of interrelational and open-ended processes, always partial, multiply layered, often contradictory and messy, and produced by active agents negotiating between all kinds of positions and working through all kinds of relationships, end quote. I love how site particularity allows for humanness, situated subjectivity, and authentic engagement with the geographies of place, assisting our understanding of the various angles from which to see a site. So in the creation of this performance process, I was also working with the various ways I have put my body into political movement and performance work in San Cristóbal de las Casas, in community, denouncing feminicide and transfeminicide, state killings and disappearances against Native and Indigenous people, feminist and transfeminist organizing and resistance, and Afro-descendant presence in the region. A region largely framed by Zapatista resistance and Native Indigenous world sensing, I was also interested in what more is here. In particular, as I made the performance work, I asked, what are the daily and ongoing forms of struggle and the political concerns that exist here because of who inhabits this place? Moving beyond the history of Zapaturismo or Zapatista tourism, what are the cosmologies that this movement has reinvigorated in the region and in the world? What are, as Macarena Gomez Baris calls them, submerged perspectives that course through daily life here? What does a trans-analytic allow us to feel, to sense, to see, without pretending to ever be able to fully know? How can I move in homage to the difficulties of the local in a place where I have been a local foreigner? And then finally, I just want to share another framework that has influenced the way I make performance work and think about place. So in San Cristóbal de las Casas, one of the native populations are the Tojolabal people. And in Tojolabal logic, one of the cosmologies that shapes San Cristóbal and names one of the native indigenous populations and their language, the dialogical relationship to conversing is different. So where in Spanish you would say, yo te dije, or I told you, the equivalent in Tojolabal is yo dije, tú escuchaste, or I said and you listened. They give equal weight to the speaker and the listener, a view of relationality that is anchored in the language that names the world sense of the people. This, quote, receptive act of listening transforms us even when we do not expect it to, end quote. Western languages give primacy to the speaker and are structured around subject-object relationality, whereas languages like Tojolabal rely on subject-subject interactions or what has been called intersubjective enactment. For instance, the earth is not an it and therefore is not related to as an object. Though I do not speak a native indigenous language and have to engage with San Cristóbal in Spanish, my work is informed by Toholabal cosmology and how I ask us and how I listen to place. So in the generation of the performance work, I use movement study, landscape, action art, reappropriate Desertos walking in the city from a decolonial perspective through San Cristóbal de las Casas, and use music, protest chants, and dress. By engaging with site-particular performance, I understand places like San Cristóbal de las Casas as sites that are co-created, and any given angle will give us different information. So I'm currently in the process of writing about the archive that I see the performance work unveiling to me, and a staging of a conversation between various types of social movements. And then through this work and seeing place differently, finally, I am forwarding a vision of a trans eco-poetics, where I insist on allowing for the unknowable, moving against the Enlightenment project of needing to know, to nail down, or to understand. In a world that constantly asks transness to explain itself, it is my intention for this book to be a conjure and constellation of possibilities that invites us to let go of the interrogation, to disrupt, to remain opaque, and to continue to believe in the poetry. And then in the chat, I'll drop a link to the performance that I'm talking about, so folks can get a sense of what I mean by performances research and how I was moving with this work. Thank you all so much.
Wonderful. I'm smiling because I enjoyed all of those presentations, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. You know, with your presentation, Professor Coleman, I was thinking of the way you moved from, you know, the idea of, whom did you say? I wrote many notes here, so let me see if I can get any of it together. La Facultad, Ansaldo, the erotic, Audre Lorde. And as you were talking about the human, I thought of Sylvia Wynter as well. You know, so you have all of those references there. And in fact, I'm thinking about the notion of the human going right across all of these presentations, because that, you know, in that struggle for social justice, that's what you're all talking about. And I also loved the idea of a conversation between San Cristóbal de las Casas, I think it was Greensboro, you said. So it's like Black civil rights and Native Indigenous conversations. But I think what really had me smiling here was the idea of relationality, the conversation, that it's not, I told you, but yo dije, tú escuchaste. So it's, I spoke, you listened. So it's that kind of, you know, that conversation. And I think you referred to it as intersubjective enactment. So, you know, I think all three presentations have given us so much to think about as we negotiate those questions that you were responding to. So let me pause for a moment and see if there's anything in the chat before I ask you all of the questions. Are there any questions for you? No? All right, let's just start off while we wait on that, you know, people getting their questions together. One of the things you said, Professor Irazábal, and I always put the accent on the last bit, and I don't think that's where it should go, all right? But one of the things you said was that it makes me want to ask you this question. In your own work, how would you, and perhaps you've answered it a bit, but I'm asking it still, how would you assess that you contribute to that transformation that you are talking about? You said, for example, that in the quotation, the task is not just to understand the world, but to change it. So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that change. And, you know, because you're talking a lot about disruption and how you contribute by your disruptive methodologies and practice generally to change. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the opportunity. I think that as teachers, we all take very seriously the type of transformation that we are facilitating to operate in our classrooms and in our teaching learning exercises through service learning and other methods, right? We all get transformed, not only the students, but also the professors. And I think of students as arrows that they have the pleasure and honor to send out into the world. They become professionals that they enact change in the world. If I remain mostly invested in academia, I'm not exercising professionally. They are the ones that are doing that, hopefully with a little bit of me in their spirits, right? So that transformation is important. But also the work that we put out there in the field of urban planning can impact policy making. And many of the reports in particular that I have, again, the honor to produce with the students through studio work, which are these service learning type of engagement with real communities and real projects, have put forth analysis and recommendations that communities take on and negotiate with decision makers, with politicians, and they have been embedded into plans, into policies, into the first housing plan that Rio de Janeiro came about with, for example, in one instance. The first time that they were formally projecting how they were planning to do better in terms of affordable housing and reducing displacement and gentrification in the city, was with some of the feedback that was produced through a class. So those happen because of intentionality. So we need to be very intentional in provoking that and making the extra step of putting our work out there that sometimes is not required by academia. The things that are valued in academia is just the publication in the scientific journal, but that type of impact in policy making and in the transformation of hearts and ways of doing things in the world is very important. And we need to be very, we need to take that responsibility on as public intellectuals that we should aspire to be.
Okay, so that in fact you answered the other question, which I didn't ask, is how do you make that balance? How do you achieve that balance? So that as far as you see it, your responsibility is more to the communities than to the demands of academia. Yes, and I noticed too that in talking about Brazil, you mentioned that housing is a human right. Yes, as far as Brazil is concerned, so it becomes also a question of reminding the politicians that this, in fact, is enshrined in their, whatever it is, their rules, their policies, their constitution. So in this way, then the scholarly work affirms this disruption.
Exactly, and we need to call attention to that. It's not solely in the Brazilian constitution, but also the Colombian, the Venezuelan, the Ecuadorian, the Bolivian. They have very progressive laws. In Colombia, for example, they not only talk about the social function of land, but also the environmental function of land. Housing is a right, but in Bolivia and Ecuador, nature has rights. So a river can demand its protection, or an endangered species can demand its protection in court in those countries. So how can we expand on that and bring greater visibility into those things that already exist and help in the implementation? Because we also need to recognize that often there is a wide and widening gap between the word and the actions.
Okay, thank you. No other questions coming through yet. Professor González, I wanted to ask you about you mentioned Ferguson as sort of that, how should I put it? I think, I'm not sure how you expressed it, but essentially that initial disruptive moment that helped you to understand what it is you wanted to do. Am I correct?
More that Ferguson was a moment that helped my discipline understand the importance of policing, and to think about the sort of profound effects that policing can have on the lives of Black youth, low-income youth, sort of racialized and impoverished communities the world over, and that this was something that the thing that had made me kind of the weird person in political science. By the time I graduated, it was the same summer that Ferguson happened, and it really changed, I think, a lot of people's research trajectories, and just to think about how these moments can really even reshape disciplines and what we think of as kind of disciplinary norms and the like. Yeah.
So that it was both you as an individual and your discipline.
Yeah, well, I for me, policing was something that was that I saw firsthand and saw as a kid, growing up in New York City, how important how that was, and seeing, around this question of thinking transnationally, sort of once I went to Argentina and saw very similar patterns of what I observed in New York City of policing, it was something that sort of fundamentally shaped me as a young person. So it was less that Ferguson convinced me of anything that I didn't know, but allowed me, that just changed the context in which I was working in professions for the rest of my field, understanding, that this was not actually that this is something that's central to study for politics specifically.
Okay, thank you. So there are some questions coming through now. One question for Professor Coleman. What are some Afro-Indigenous writers that you're in conversation with in your work? And that's a question from Nancy Vera.
Yes. So the person that I've been primarily thinking with folks who are, because there's such a beautiful conversation happening between Blackness and indigeneity. I feel like this is really a moment where people are thinking of those, thinking of Blackness and indigeneity together, and not always as separate and separable. And so one of the scholars who does identify with indigeneity and Blackness is Tiffany Latabo King, and her work on the Black shoals. And so I'm really interested in the shoal epistemology. So we are not limiting Blackness to the ocean and indigeneity to land. And so that, and then still finding, right now I've been seeing more like Black scholars and Indigenous scholars and putting them into conversation, but I'm still unpeeling and am open to hearing more about Afro-Indigenous scholars, but that's where that conversation began.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Keisha Allen, another one of our graduate students, asked, well, she comments and asks, she says, I was interested in the discussion on language of ecology and geographies of place. And I would like Dr. Coleman to further elaborate on these terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was loving what Dr. Irazábal was talking about, because I think the question of the damage to the climate is so foundational to what brought me to this work, because of all of the things that we try to think of as unnatural, especially queer people, trans people. And so I find ecology is a really interesting heuristic, and also something that is literal, right? Like trans people are not ruining the earth, right? It's multinational corporations, it's, right, all of these other things. And so I'm reappropriating ecology and thinking of transness as its own ecological space, from which to reimagine environment and geography. Because particularly for those of us who understand transness not as a binary beginning from and going to, but actually something that can see various layers, and not attempt to erase all of those layers over time, and thinking about the coloniality of environment and place. So really interested in space. And then rethinking geography through site particular performance. Because we tend to imagine places as historically as things that can be known, right? We can know this about a place. This is the characteristic of that place. And especially places that, you know, like Chiapas, where it's like it's only Zapatismo. It's like, no, actually it's not. And there are people who have issues with Zapatismo and the limitations of Zapatismo. So how do we imagine geography as something that is co-constructed by the people and the things and the objects moving through? Yeah, so that's how I'm thinking about those things.
And I realize I missed one of the questions from Nancy. And let me just comment here as well that the students are interested in what you have to say, what you all have to say, and also in how it intersects with some of the things that they're researching. And I make this comment as I look at Nancy's question and realize that she's looking at Afro-Mexico. So her question is, I am interested in hearing more about how you use Black feminism to understand issues in Mexico. Due to the African history in Mexico, do you see a hybridity between Afro and indigenous theories in the areas you are working in?
Thank you for that question, Nancy. Yeah, I wrote my dissertation on how Black women construct their identities in Chiapas. So I've been deep inside of this for a number of years now. I find Black feminism really, really interesting in the context of Chiapas because a lot of times we don't talk enough about anti-Blackness in indigenous communities. And it's been only recently that we've seen more collaborations on that front. And also that we always talk about, we don't talk enough about Blackness as indigenous, right? So if we think of like Garifuna people, right? Think of the entire continent, right? And so not wanting to make those separations too strict, but in the context of Mexico, what I find so important about Black feminism in particular, in relation to my investments in transness and other forms of sexual dissidence, is that there is a trend, and some Black scholars and friends of mine in Chiapas have mentioned this, that in the mestiza feminism, right, which can be a more kind of whitened branch of feminism in the context of Chiapas, there's a claim, or many claims, that transness is like this neoliberal project and a trend, right? Whereas Black feminists are looking at Black and indigenous scholars and ancestors, right? So thinking about Maria Lugones, Coley Driscoll, Oyeronke Oyewumi, who understand the Black and indigenous gender understandings, pre-colonial and today, right? Have always had a different understanding of gender beyond the Western European hegemonic construct. And so Black feminisms become really, really important to reimagining gender for Black and indigenous people in Chiapas. And there's been some really, really beautiful movement and organizing work by mestiza lesbians for indigenous women who leave their communities because they're lesbian and trans, for instance. So there's a lot of really important conversations to be had there. Yeah.
Okay, one of the questions I'd like to ask, I suppose, to everyone is following up on something that Professor González mentioned, and this was about objectivity in research. Is that something you all come across, you know, in critiques of, you know, various kinds of work in your own research? And perhaps I don't need to ask Professor Coleman, because I noticed when you were talking about performance as methodology, you said some things, you know, that seemed to specifically suggest, you know, there are things I'm not interested in, which sort of answered that question a bit. But anybody, would you like to pick up on that? Research and what's objective and what's not? I thought you talked in really interesting ways about that, Professor González. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Sure. So I think that as my research, so I have been working sort of in the area of human rights for a number of years. And during my graduate program, I was working on sort of a human rights collective. I'm Dominican, and during my my PhD program, I was working, sort of as an activist supporting the rights of Dominicans of Haitian descent. And working transnationally, sort of within the Dominican and Haitian diasporas in the U.S. To sort of build support for folks that were experiencing, just a very egregious human rights violations. And I always felt like in my political science program, I had to hide my activism and my and that kind of work. And so sort of what I have started, sort of have been able to do sort of since that day, which the day that I mentioned, where it was sort of, it was clear that like I had to take a side, very, literally I was between the families of the police and families of the victims, and thinking about, okay, this notion of like, oh, I'm the objective scholar and I need to talk to both sides and etc. My work has become a lot more tied to advocacy and sort of creating spaces to advocate for, to sort of share the space that I have with folks who have been directly affected by police violence. And so just to give you a sense, I applied for a grant, and I was talking about, accompaniment as being central to my methodology. And, the reviewers came back and they were like, well, isn't this advocacy, is this research? Which I think is something that a lot of folks in the social sciences will end up coming across, right? And so sort of blurring these lines between research and advocacy doesn't mean that you don't do rigorous research. It doesn't mean you sort of predetermine what the outcome of the research will be, but that there is a sort of a broader goal of your research that is very much tied to and is accountable to the communities that are participants in your research. And so I think that that's that's something that has been very important to me, sort of in the institutions that I've been a part of. And so just to give you a sense, right, sort of thinking about, okay, how do I get grants that will allow me to sort of bring the mothers in as co-PIs, or how do I make sure that, now I'm at the Kennedy School, my students are people who are going to go and rule the world in many literal senses, right? And so sort of how do I make sure that part of their training is listening, not hearing me talk about these things, but hearing directly from the voices of the people that have been affected, that never would have space to be the featured speakers at a place like Harvard. And so I think that that's kind of where I've landed on sort of objectivity, where sort of even claiming to be objective is taking a side, right? And in sort of on behalf of existing power structures, right? In a lot of ways. And so I would say that that's kind of where I'm at in thinking about objectivity and the kind of I'm trying to think of a not rude word. Just that it is a kind of an illusion in a lot of ways.
Right, and that also has a bearing on the comments you were making about the disciplinary focus, that people ask, hey, is this really social science?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Professor Irazábal?
I think that we are to a certain extent lucky in the field of urban planning, because we have such a thing that is called equity planning and advocacy planning. So that have created a formal opening for us to do just that, advocacy planning. And that's a choice that I think that we need to embrace, and we need to occupy objectivity, embrace subjectivity, and be biased for both people on the one hand and causes on the other. Yeah, we need to be biased for the poor, the disenfranchised, the historically marginalized, the minoritized and racialized communities that exist everywhere, not only in the United States, but everywhere, and certainly in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we need to be for justice, we need to be for sustainability. And we do that embrace from the initial research questions that we pose, the type of research and the type of engagements of all kinds, including performances that we engage in. And talking about performance, if I may, I would want to hear from Danielle also about performance in the academy, right? We're all performers. You're an artist and you perform in a certain artistic way, but we as academics, professors and students alike, are performing our roles in academia and are, you know, trying to portray certain personas. So how can we use such performances in disruptive ways to bring about, you know, greater room for people of color and more attention to these things of justice and sustainability?
Yes.
Oh my goodness, I think we could have a whole panel this time. Oh,
Yes.
gosh, yeah, I think performance is a really, because I come from performance studies, so we're always thinking about performance, not just in, you know, performing art and making these sorts of things, but how do we understand the ways that we show up in space, right? How we are teaching, how we are being with one another. And I think one of the most disruptive things we can do in drawing attention to our performances in academia are the ways we connect with each other, the ways that we are building relationships that are not just about the performance in a way. I feel deeply invested in that cultural work and changing how we are occupying space together. And I feel very privileged in my current position too, because making performance work is actually valued as scholarship towards tenure. But I also know that it was my insistence on that made it so, right? And changing policy and really showed, like, demonstrating the rigor of that work alongside the writing. So I think performance works on many fronts, but I think, yeah, what I would say in answer to that, Dr. Irazábal, is how can we also, as people engaged in change and on public fronts, let go of some of the performances of the academy in order for us to have a cultural engagement with each other to make the academy that we want. Yeah, that's what I would say.
What a fabulous response. You know, I think, in fact, I think there's quite a movement now because, and I'm saying quite a movement, meaning two people. You're the second person I'm hearing say that, you know, I went into what might be considered a traditional department, but I insisted that performance is going to be accepted for tenure. So, you know, so I think that's wonderful. And Professor Irazábal, I hope people were taking notes there when you know, made those comments about the academy and the fact that it's a daily performance. It's not something that's often admitted, but I think, you know, that is special. That was a really great comment. Any other questions, comments? I'm not seeing comments in the other questions. Oh, there must be some. Sorry, I think I am just missing them. Oh, yes, sorry. Professor Irazábal, can you comment a little more about your experience with disasters in Chile? In line with the theme of the conference, what were the generative and destructive ruptures of the earthquake?
Yes, well, it's a bittersweet history, the one that I can relate to you coming from our work in Chile, in Talca in particular, but many other communities in Chile that immediately reacted to issues of supporting each other in the emergency after the earthquake, but certainly beyond that reconstruction. After a disaster, you have different phases. There's an immediate emergency, there is a short-term planning that needs to occur, and there is also long-term planning. Well, people were very savvy in getting together with each other to support each other in all of those phases and to put out very complete plans that, in the case of Talca, got accepted by the municipality. but immediately revoked after the local government got some directions from the federal government. In Chile, as in many other Latin American and Caribbean countries, government is very centralized. In Chile, is especially so, and they wanted to do things top down there in manners that promoted the neoliberal order that they were the first one to implement in Latin America and the world. Neoliberalism was born in Chile and spread to the rest of the world from there with the help of the so-called Chicago boys from the Chicago University here in the States. And they wanted to enact what Naomi Klein has called, disaster capitalism, inject further neoliberalization of the economy, but life itself after the earthquake. And that did away with the effort or to the more formal effort of the community. Of course, they continued resisting that and supporting each other in the process, but the greatest impact that they could have had if their plans had indeed been not only adopted as it was for a short period, but implemented, was unfortunately ultimately lost.
Okay. We have another question from Sergio. Profesora, oh no, es lo mismo. He asked it in both Spanish and English, it seems.
Gracias.
A question, and that's a conversation between you now. Professor Coleman has a question. Dr. González, I would love to hear more about the conversations that have occurred amongst families who have dealt with police violence in the different places you mentioned. Was it Colombia, Brazil, the US?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll just sort of note a couple of things. I mean, the first of which is just the importance of translation. There's so many conversations, so often in our universities, when we invite people from Latin America, we require them to know English, right? And we sort of, which already means that we're going to be inviting people from overall, right, from a certain segment of society, right, and not necessarily the ones that we want to hear from most urgently. And so one of the things that has been most important is just seeing the importance of translation in order to bridge boundaries that have been imposed on us, right? And so just to give you a sense of language, and sometimes even just language isn't necessary. That so when the first event that we did, the first gathering with mothers from Chicago, Colombia, and Brazil. One of the mothers of a victim of police killings in Sao Paulo, who's a very just incredible organizer, she met Sandra Bland's mother, Geneva Reedville, and when and of course Sandra Bland's case was internationally known, and so the mother from Brazil knew about the Sandra Bland case, and she just, the two of them just embraced each other in a way that just transcended language, transcended nationality, transcended any other differences that these two women's lives may have had, but it was just an understanding of a shared pain and a shared struggle that they had both been forced to undertake by the state, and so it just spoke volumes, and so that alone was so inspiring to sort of just continue the conversations, which is why we continued trying to have these meetings as much as we could until the pandemic paused it. And another sort of really compelling piece was when we did a workshop in Cali in Colombia with mothers, the same group of mothers. And there was a mother whose son had been shot in Chicago, and a mother whose son had been shot in Cali, and they described very similar processes by which the bodies of their sons went through through being shot by police in very similar ways. Even they were thousands of miles apart, they both were able to convey sharing this very similar down to the point of how their sons died. And so these gatherings have created such intimate spaces, and to the point where, you know, we just sort of think about the ways that they understand. And even though I speak the 3 languages, I could never understand that what their experience is, the way that they amongst themselves understand their experiences. And so yes, I mean, I could you know, share so much more, but you know, one of the things that even virtually we've tried to keep this going. We had an event in the fall at Harvard, sort of thinking about mothers on the front lines of these battles against and families, right? We sort of see George Floyd's family, the way that they have taken, you know, such leadership in this. And so, yeah, so we've tried to keep it going remotely, sort of continue to build these relationships. So yes, we had an event with mothers, again, from Colombia, the US, and Brazil, thinking about, you know, also how COVID has sort of the added layer of COVID to all of everybody's struggle, as another sort of shared experience. So yeah, I'll stop there, but it's been, you know, just again, that was a transformative moment. Sort of, I think Dr. Collins had asked to Dr. Irazábal, sort of, how are you transforming, you know, what changes are you seeking to make? And I think that I may not personally, you know, sort of cause any changes, but at least if we create spaces for people to meet, and for ideas to grow, and for, you know, plotting and conspiring to occur, I think that that in itself can be really transformative.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to all 3 of you. And what strikes me is that we have these powerfully disruptive presentations from various disciplines, from women's gender and sexuality studies, from social science, from urban planning. And, you know, it really kind of replicates the sense of, the strong sense of interdisciplinarity that we have at Lasc. So you've given us a real treat today. There's a lot to think about. And don't be surprised if we reach out to you in the future in one form or the other. Thank you so much for these excellent, very thought-provoking presentations. They will certainly last us a year or 2 just to, you know, pick through things and continue talking. Thanks a lot. And so now, thank you, all those of you listening in. Thank you to our audience. And we move now to Danielle Laplace, who is going to give some closing remarks.